Last week we looked at several of the things that Paul taught those in Corinth, urging them to act like men, especially focused on teaching them grow up spiritually. They needed to mature, and so we pointed that out in various ways. And maybe that's what spiritually is often most emphasized, because Jesus came and he was a man, he was a male, and we know of God as Father. But it's also true that spirits, God is spirit, and spirits are neither male nor female. The male and female body and brain are certainly very different from each other, but the mind of man and woman both come from God, and so reflect God in some ways, in different ways. And so the fact is that we not only need to act like men, there are also times where we need to understand what God gave to the woman, and there are things in which man and woman need to imitate her. And considering the confusion in our society, what this does mean and does not mean, I think will be clear as we study today. But there are the traits of a godly woman that men need to observe and learn from and imitate. We're going to look at three of those this morning. Act like a woman in gentleness, in submissiveness, and in devotion. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, let's think about acting like a woman, being gentle. There's a reason that the children go to mother when they've skinned their knee and when they have different problems, even often as they grow. It's because mothers have a gentleness, and that's not a weakness, it's a strength. And gentleness draws people, and and not just in youth. And so notice what Paul says of his time and of his heart for the saints in Thessalonica. In 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 7 and 8, notice how he describes himself. He says, We were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children, so affectionately longing for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. So, of all the ways that Paul could have described his love and the time that he had for them, notice he describes himself, compares himself as a nursing mother. What is more gentle than that? And so this is how deeply Paul cared for those he taught. He wasn't some emotional or emotionless teacher. He was someone who said what he did because of his deep, genuine concern and interest for those he taught. And he describes that even further in verse 8. So affectionately longing to you because you've become dear to us. Some people might say, well, that's not very manly speech. Well, it isn't. Paul isn't intending it to be. He's trying to express gentleness. And so in expressing that gentleness and his affection for them, he describes himself in language generally associated with a woman. And so when do men, included, men and women, need to be gentle? Look at verse 13 of the same chapter. He described his gentleness among them, and that began from the beginning of his time in the city of Thessalonica and among these people. He says, For this reason we also thank God without ceasing, because when you received the word of God which you heard from us, you welcomed it, not as the word of men, but as it is in truth the word of God, which also effectively works in you who believe. You can gently teach people who have the kind of attitude that he described the Thessalonians as having, that when they recognized what Paul was saying, when they recognized that it was from God and was not just some man-made religion, some man-made teaching, but that it really was from God, then they responded to it consistent to that. He didn't have to push and prod and pressure them. They understood that it was from God, and so they reacted to it that way. People who are humble and tender in their conscience, they can be appealed to gently, and they respond to that gentleness in willing submission. So when is gentleness needed? Well, it's needed when we go out and in trying to teach the lost. We should begin from an assumption that we can be gentle. And Sometimes people may show otherwise, and in Paul's teaching, he couldn't always be gentle, but that's the starting place. And so, in trying to teach the lost, start with gentleness. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1, when is gentleness needed? Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. So when there's sin in fellow Christians, then we have to begin with gentleness, and sometimes the response doesn't allow gentleness to continue, but the starting place is gentleness, and he says reflecting on ourselves pushes us in that direction so that we aren't tempted to sin. And then in Titus chapter 3 in verse 2, here Paul is writing to Titus, just speaking of our general conduct and what people should see in us. And among other things, he says, to speak evil of no one, to be peaceable, gentle, showing humility to all men. So when should we be gentle? And what Paul says here is our general conduct. When we're among the lost, when we're among the saved, in our home, just in everywhere, people should know us as generally gentle people. And that's, if we have the right picture of Jesus, then that's who he was on a typical basis. The general teaching and conduct of Jesus was gentle until some situation demanded otherwise. So how was your gentleness seen this past week? Again, what Paul says here, that before all men, that's what they should be seeing. So how was that seen this week? How is your gentleness going to be known tomorrow? I don't know how hard and difficult tomorrow may be, but people need to see your gentleness among those occasions. Now, are there limits to gentleness? Of course there are, because the same people to whom Paul said, I was gentle among you and like a nursing mother. Well, then in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, after he had taught them to work and he had given them that example and he had written to them about that, then he wrote to them again and he said some stronger things, some harsher things. So gentleness has its limits, as the mercy of God and the patience of God does. But what Paul is saying is the rule, and our general conduct should be described in this word. So on all these occasions, and then look at a few passages that identify some specific people and that gentleness should be a part of their conduct. What we've seen is, everybody all the time. But there's a few specific occasions where it's mentioned. For example, Paul in writing to Timothy, and so most of what Paul says would apply to all Christians in 1 and 2 Timothy, but especially Paul's writing to Timothy because of his work as an evangelist. And so what he says in verse 24 would apply to everybody, but in particular, it would address evangelists. A servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but be gentle to all, able to teach, patient. So who should be gentle? Evangelists should be, preachers should be gentle. That should be what they're known for. In verses 25 and 26, again, even the nature of the work of an evangelist, convincing and rebuking and exhorting, there's going to be some times where there is a stronger action and words that have to be spoken, but the starting place is gentleness, even in controversy and even in conflict. Look at 25 and 26. In humility, correcting those who are in opposition, if God perhaps will grant them repentance, so that they may know the truth, and that they may come to their senses and escape the snare of the devil, having been taken captive by him to do his will. So again, the starting place in conflict and controversy, gentleness can't always continue, but when the battle begins, the hope is that there are some tender hearts, some gentle hearts who would respond to gentleness. And then when you find different, then the battle has to be waged. But evangelists should have as their baseline gentleness to seek to draw men to their Savior. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, 1 Timothy chapter 3, Paul's writing to especially describing the characteristics, the traits of someone who's prepared to do the work of an overseer, of a pastor, of an elder. And in verse 3, he's not to be given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome. Who's prepared to do the work of an evangelist? Well, we have the saying, a gentleman. What's that? What does that mean? A gentle man. That's who's prepared to lead the flock and to be an overseer, someone who understands and has long time has demonstrated gentleness. That's the nature, though I've not done it, that's the nature of the work of a shepherd working with real sheep. And so that's among the most common pictures of leadership. Sheep are led by gentle leaders, and that's the reputation of someone who's prepared to do the work of an overseer. And then one more in James chapter 3 and verse 17, just to echo what we've already read, but that this is not just a trait for the preacher. This is not just a trait for the overseers. James 3 and verse 17 says, "The wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy." And again, judging by our society's ideas or ideals of a manly man, of a real leader, these are not often the traits that get included in that. And so be it. The traits that God is looking for in leaders and in those who are following is someone who would act like a woman, who would learn and have the discernment of gentleness. Turn to Ephesians chapter 5. Act like a woman and learn to submit. Again, in our society, we often have to give some explanation because, well, in reality, it's selfishness that says, I don't ever want to submit. I want to have my way as many times as possible. Some people might view submission as a weakness, but every Christian has to learn submission, and we have Christ as the ultimate example of that, but God has also provided a means by which we are around people who have not just learned to define the word submission, but that's their habit, that's their practice, that's what they spend much of their life doing. And that's godly women, especially godly wives. They spend decades learning submissiveness, and when we have to apply the same principle, that means God has surrounded us. If you know godly women, godly wives, then you have an example of someone, especially if you're a man and you're a husband whose focus has to mainly be on leading, rightfully so. But then when the husband has to submit, as men do in different occasions, he has a woman to whom he can look as an example. Here's someone who has practiced submission for many years. What can I learn from her and translate those principles when it's time for the man to submit? Well, in Ephesians chapter 5, here's why. We could say submissiveness is a trait of women, because wives are told, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. And so in the home, in the family relationship, this is not an American cultural thing. This is not a man-made idea. This is the role that God has given to women, is that they would submit to their husbands. And so God deserves the credit for that. That's the wisdom of God. And sometimes it may take us time to understand, well, why did God do it that way? And in the meantime, until we understand it, we submit to Him. We do it God's way. And sometimes we eventually figure out, oh, well, that was a good idea. That was the right way. But even if we never do, as we read earlier from Job 38, our mind is full of reasons that we just submit to God because He is God. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, again, submissiveness is associated with women. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, let a woman learn in silence with all submission, and I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. Now the word silence there is quietness. It doesn't mean she cannot speak, she cannot say a word. But in the teaching, he says, he implies the man will teach, he will have authority. The woman is not to have authority. There is some speaking she could do that would not be taking authority. But the general point that is made here is that the men are to provide, especially in spiritual things, that the men are to provide the leadership, and therefore the woman is to submit. So just based on these two passages, who would have the most experience, who would have the most practice, and therefore maybe in some ways a better understanding of submission, a man or a woman? Well, in many ways a woman would. And therefore when a man finds himself in a place where he's supposed to submit, how can he better understand that? From whom could he learn? Of course it starts with God, but he could learn from a godly woman. Turn to Hebrews 13, verse 17. So let's look at some passages that show us that often it is men, the male, who has to submit. And so in that, he should learn to act like a woman. In Hebrews 13 and verse 17, it says, "Obey those who rule over you and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls as those who must give account. Let them do so with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable for you." And so here describing the overseers, the bishops, the elders, the pastors of a local church, he's saying every member whom they oversee has the responsibility to be submissive. Exactly the same word, the same principle, the same concept that is addressed to women in other passages. And so every member who in a local church is doing the work under the oversight of elders, they have to learn the same principle of submission. We've already read from 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, but would just apply that principle to the local church in the absence of elders. Well then, how does a church work together when there are not those who can do that work of overseeing? And because he says that the women are not to teach or have authority, well then who is? Well, then that implies the men are to teach and to have the authority. And so in the absence of overseers, of bishops, then the women would submit to the men in the work of the local church. But then go to 1 Peter chapter 5. Even within the local church, women are not exclusively the ones who have the responsibility to submit. 1 Peter chapter 5, there's kind of two sections to this, so just the first part says, "Likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders." So the younger should submit to the older. And here this isn't younger men or younger women or older men or older women. This is just in that generally broad terms. And so the younger have to learn how to work together with those who are older. And in general, the younger would submit to the older. But then the next part of verse 5 says, "Yes, all of you be submissive to one another, and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." So the younger submit to the older, but then here, everybody, he says, submit to everybody. And at least part of that would mean that even at times the older would submit to the younger, meaning this. Hopefully those who are older have the discernment and have the humility to recognize that on occasion someone who is younger may have an idea, a suggestion in matters of opinion, may have an idea that's better than their idea. Well, the arrogant older person is going to say, well, here, I'm going to put my seniority card down, and since I'm older, just take your ideas and keep them to yourselves, but the older leads, so my decision automatically goes. But someone who is older, with the humility that's described here, should have the discernment and humility to say, well, you're younger, but yeah, what you're saying, that I can see there's wisdom in that. That's a good idea. So let's not go with my preference. Let's go with the preference of this one or with some who are younger. So again, the younger don't have a trump card per se, but the older should have the wisdom to be willing to submit when the occasion would justify that. And so what this teaches us is that there are those who are to submit to others, and yet even with that, we can all work together, listen to each other, consider one another, and then figure out how do we work together when my opinion is not the prevailing opinion, when the decision that is made was not my preference. How as men and as women are we going to respond to occasions like that? Well, where could we go for an example of someone who has maybe spent many years doing that? Go to a godly wife who maybe has often not had her preference, but been submissive to the Lord and therefore to her husband. In the local church, godly wives are an example to us. And think about how many different occasions when this has to be done. Of how many decisions there are. For example, the funds that are gathered on the first day of the week. Well, to whom are those going to be shared? And how much is going to be shared? And on what particular specific occasions? God has given us some general instructions of the church's work is to care for those Christians who are in need and to do the work of teaching the lost and building each other up. So God has provided those general guidelines, but within that, there's a lot of specific decisions that have to be made, to whom and how much and how often. But it's not just that. God has given a general guideline that saints assemble before Him and with each other on the first day of the week. That's not up to debate and discussion and opinions. But within that general instruction, where are we going to meet? And how often are we going to meet? Once, twice, 3 times? Early in the morning, middle of the morning, later in the morning, early afternoon, middle afternoon, late afternoon, later in the evening. There's lots of decisions that have to be made, and when you have even a small number of people, you're going to have a small number of different opinions. So how are we going to make and to continue in these kinds of decisions? What about, are we going to meet on any day that isn't the first day of the week? God didn't say we had to, but are we going to meet on any other day? And for what purpose? What will we do? You'd have maybe as many different opinions about whether we should and how often and what time than you do people contributing to that decision. Are we going to have a radio program? Are we going to have a booth here or there in the community to try to teach? Well, how often are we going to do that? Which ones will we? Which ones will we not commit to? You get the idea. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of decisions that have to be made. And in each of those decisions, you're going to have different opinions. How are we going to work together as one when we're going to have a variety of different preferences about things which God did not specifically already determine? The majority of the time, those are the easier things, right? When God said do it, then we should all have the same preference to do exactly what God said. But when God is general and He leaves some judgments and decisions to us, there are a few things that will splinter a church quicker than the attitude that says, well, my preference wasn't decided, and therefore I'm not going to participate. I won't object. I'll let the people who decided that, I'm just going to let them handle it. But that wasn't what I thought was best, and so I'm just going to wash my hands of it. If we're going to grow together, then we have to work together. We have to submit to one another, even when we don't get our preference. And judging by some of these general teachings, it could rightfully be said, on those occasions when I don't get my way, then act like a woman, like a godly woman. And then one other area that women have the reputation for is being devoted to their family. Now, that's not a slight to godly husbands. But even the most devoted husband can learn from his wife, because for various reasons, women are often superior. Just speaking generally, women have more often gained the reputation of being devoted to their family than men. Let's think of a few passages that remind us of a woman's devotion to the physical family. Turn to 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15. After Paul has discussed the role of women and even their submission, and then the background for that being Adam and Eve, and that the leadership of man and the submission of woman, he says, was reflected in the order of creation in verse 13. And in verse 15, after describing Eve's sin, he says, "Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control." Now, the difficult part of this verse is that it goes from she to they. She will be saved in childbearing after talking about Eve. But then it says, if they continue in faith and love and hope and holiness. Without digging into that verse at this time, that's the difficult part. But I just want to focus on the easy part. This is not talking about salvation from sin, I don't believe. But the emphasis that's given here is her role in childbearing. There was something about childbearing which is reflective of her role in the home. There are some women who can't have children, so this is not saying, well, they're just in a different class. But childbearing is describing the unique and distinctive role of the woman, and that's reflected here of something that is of great value to God. And so that's what is chosen here. Her role in the home is emphasized and held up and valued by God. And so everything else that she does, whatever work she does that's related, is not a distraction to the home, but it's a way of serving the home. Our society is in a struggle. If we follow what God says, we don't have that struggle, but we're surrounded by a society that struggles, that's in a struggle among itself of what are the things about a woman that should be valued and held up as the ideal. And what are the things among people who print the magazines and get the most attention? Well, it's her outward appearance. That's what gets the glamour and the glitz and the attention and the dollars often. What is typically absent from that part of society? What's the things that we were talking about this morning? Her gentleness, her submission, and her role in the physical home. They don't make the covers of the magazines. And in the television shows, those are typically not the things about the female part. Or in movies, those are typically not the things that are emphasized. Here's the leading role of a woman. And so we're going to spend an hour and a half watching a movie about a woman who was gentle and submissive and devoted to her home. Because people aren't going to buy that magazine. They're not going to watch that movie. They're not going to watch that show. So we live within a culture that is struggling to define and to decide what are we going to elevate about a woman. And then, of course, we even have some who say, well, I'm not a biologist, so I don't even know what a woman is. Our society is struggling with that. We shouldn't be. I'm not going to read these other passages, but Titus 2, 4 and 5, in describing what the older women would teach the younger women. A good portion of that is emphasizing the role of the home. When you read Proverbs chapter 31, what is it that makes a woman's value far above rubies? And you just go through that passage, and if they had magazines and movies back then, which of the things in Proverbs 31 would have had her cast into that leading role? That can be on one side of the paper. And then on the other side of the paper, list the things mentioned there that relate to her work in the home. And you know which side of that paper will be bare and which will be full. And so women have demonstrated their devotion to the home, and men need to learn from wives, and men need to learn from mothers to be devoted to their family. Doesn't mean they have the same role, doesn't mean they do everything in exactly the same way, but men should choose their work on the basis, not of the things that our society values most of the time, but on the basis of, I'm going to do this work because of my devotion to my family. A man's work should provide the basic needs of the family, should not create needs within the family. That's not why God taught us to work, to cause an obstacle to the family. Work is intended to aid the family. Our work, husbands, should be a servant to the family, not the master of the family. And so as men, again, our society doesn't typically help this. I don't know in high school if you had to take one of those aptitude tests that, well, here's the career path you should choose. How much of those kinds of tests emphasize, well, be sure you choose a career path that's going to help give you the time and the attention and the focus to build a godly family. Just not on the radar of those often driving the career type decisions of our society. And so it takes wisdom to recognize the things that are valued by God that are not valued by our society. But as men, we need to recognize those things and be devoted to our family. Often, let's be as devoted or learn from the devotion of our wives. And then turn to 1 Timothy 5 and verse 10. Here's an example of a woman devoted to the spiritual family, a woman devoted to God's people. And her devotion to the spiritual family is a reflection of her devotion to her physical family. And that's all captured here in these few words within 1 Timothy 5 and verse 10. Here describing a woman who would be a widow, who would be cared for in physical things by the church on a permanent basis. Here's who she is to be. Verse 10, well reported for good works. If she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. Could say that this is the Reader's Digest version of Proverbs 31. If you went through 1 Timothy 5:10 and said, well, what did raising her children, bringing up children, what were some specific things that involved? Well, Proverbs 31 would give you a list. What is required of someone who's going to lodge strangers? Proverbs 31 would give you some specifics. If she's going to wash the saints' feet and relieve the afflicted, well, Proverbs 31 will tell you some of the things that she's involved in. And so this woman is the New Testament virtuous woman. And by the things, again, even though this is short, where do these kinds of things direct her attention on a daily basis, on a weekly basis? As a rule, her attention here is towards her family and towards her brethren, those whom she has lodged and served and relieved. And so men ought to pay attention to that. It doesn't mean they would always be doing the same thing at the same time in the same way, but men could learn from this degree of devotion to God's people. And so would that describe women? Would that describe you? Verse 10. And then men, in principle, are you doing those same kinds of things? If we are, in our relationship with each other as Christians, then men and women are devoted to their physical home, but then they're devoted to each other, ongoing, regular attention to each other. And when that happens, then people won't have the problem that comes up from time to time. Well, I just don't feel like I'm a part of that church. And so they fade into the background and then they float away and they're gone, and we wonder, well, what happened to them? People who are invested in each other know that they belong to each other, know that they are needed, and know what they can do. Does that describe your perception of your role in this congregation or in the congregation where you are? It means asking yourself, what am I contributing? What am I contributing to the plans that this church makes really on a weekly basis? There are Bible classes on a weekly basis. If you've taught, you know that requires planning. What are you contributing to the planning that contributes to the Bible classes, to the booths that we have on occasion, to a gospel meeting? There's a variety of plans that go into that. Are you contributing what you can to the planning part? Because if there aren't plans, then we all know what happens after that. And then what are you contributing to the participation in those things? In our Bible classes, in our gospel meetings, in our efforts in the community. You don't need to compare your time and your hours and your effort to anyone else here, but just your part. What was her part What's your part? What does devotion require of me? And I can't find a verse that's going to live the list, the 10 things you've got to do this week to be a faithful member of a congregation. If I was in Jerusalem, that church had some unique strengths and weaknesses that were very different than those in Corinth. They were very different than the church in Thyatira in Revelation chapter 3. So what is my part? Well, part of that depends on me knowing my brothers and sisters well enough to know what is needed and then invest myself in that. And so that involves being an active part, which includes participating when we assemble consistently according to my ability, but goes far beyond that, doesn't it? Doing my part means asking how can I help, not waiting for someone to come tell me what needs to be done. Taking initiative, looking for what can I do, what's being overlooked, even accidentally, how can I help? Paying attention to what are the strengths of this church? What are the weaknesses of this church? How can I help to ensure those strengths continue to grow? How can I help to fill in a gap where there's some weakness? That's not necessarily obvious. It takes somebody devoted, attentive to recognize those things. And so who's going to give that much attention to God's people? It's going to be someone who is willing to be devoted, someone willing to act like and imitate a woman. Who's talking about these kind of traits to our daughters? Who are setting these as the things that we want our daughters to focus on, talk about, practice, pray about? Who talks about these words? This week, did you hear anyone talk about or have a show about gentleness, submission, and devotion? Those words have to be spoken in our home, and we'll do that from time to time when we come together. But that groundwork has to be laid in the hearts of our girls, but not just of them. Who's going to help our young men to recognize not only to value those things in women, but to instill those things in themselves? Who's helping the young men of America, of Alaska, of Fairbanks? Who's helping the young men to value and to practice those things in their own lives? In addition to, I want to find someone and marry someone like that. Who's on your side helping you do that? There are few. Our bodies are male and female, but our soul is not. And so pay attention to godly women in Scripture. That's a great study for men and for women. But pay attention to people around you who demonstrate these traits so that male and female, we will learn to please God by acting like women. Jesus did. Jesus came to this earth, and if one of the traits that would summarize his life is submission and devotion and even gentleness. Meek and lowly in heart, and so you can have, he will serve your soul in that way. Jesus did. Are you willing to? And are you willing to follow someone? Are you willing to follow a leader like that? None of us always have. If you're here this morning, as we sing number 249, if you recognize yourself separated from God because of your sin and you want a leader who demonstrates these kinds of traits, and maybe you never have, maybe your parents weren't like that, maybe your spouse isn't like that, you have someone willing to lead you who is like that, and then who will train you in that. But your first need is to follow him. If you need to confess your faith this morning, if you need to be baptized into Christ by your faith in the working of God, then he'll wash away your sins. If as a Christian you need to return in your heart to him, and we can stir you up to that love and to those good works, come forward and tell us how we could help you as we stand and sing.